The Committee on Homeland Security Subcommittee on Oversight, Investigations, and Accountability will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. The purpose of today's hearing is to investigate the federal government's efforts to prevent goods made with Uyghur forced labor in China from entering the United States. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing of the subcommittee follows up on our previous hearing on enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in October. During that October hearing, a panel of policy experts and industry representatives highlighted ongoing issues and concerns relating to preventing goods made with Uyghur forced labor from being imported into the United States. While importing goods made with forced labor has been against federal law since 1930, through implementation of the UFLPA, Congress recognized that China's state-sponsored system of forced labor represents a unique challenge on account of its mass scale and the regime's power to obstruct investigations into forced labor. This is an economic, strategic, and moral issue, and the UFLPA marked a significant step towards countering China's predatory and exploitative practices. Unfortunately, China's use of forced labor in global supply chains continues to pose a significant enforcement challenge across a wide range of economic sectors, including textiles, minerals, and seafood. For example, the overwhelming majority of cotton used in Chinese textile products is grown in Xinjiang province, which the UFLPA specifically singles out as a focal point of China's state-sponsored forced labor regime. Any cotton grown in the province is presumptively linked to forced labor under the UFLPA, yet CBP's isotopic testing of clothing samples still found items shipped to the U.S. made with cotton from Xinjiang, and CBP detained $46 million worth of textile and clothing imports for suspected UFLPA violations since June 2022. Yet CBP's detention rate is just a sliver of the billions of dollars of textile products the U.S. imports annually from China, emphasizing the continuing challenge in effectively enforcing the UFLPA. Furthermore, those seeking to profit off goods tainted with forced labor use a wide range of tactics to obscure forced labor in the supply chain, such as shipping products through other countries to disguise the country of origin, mixing inputs produced with forced labor with clean inputs, and misrepresenting the origin of the products in question. Technology such as isotopic testing can help identify inputs traced to a geographic area, such as cotton grown in Xinjiang, but it is not clear how widely or routinely such forensic technologies are being used. In our October hearing, several witnesses pointed to the rapid increase in de minimis shipments as an avenue for prohibited goods to enter the United States. With de minimis shipments more than doubling over the last 5 years and more than 1 billion de minimis shipments entering the U.S. in fiscal year 2023. As you would expect, an increase in shipments increases the chances of contraband getting through. The majority of these de minimis shipments originate in China. Our witnesses also highlighted the limited scale of the UFLPA entity list. This list contains 30 entities, only 10 of which have been added since the initial list was published. Notably, many of those entities on the initial list were already subject to withhold release orders blocking their imports, so they were already on the government's radar. It seems that the entity list is merely scratching the surface of the vast universe of potential entities that could be listed. Is the interagency process to consider new additions too cumbersome? Are there ways this process might be improved? More broadly, given Beijing's resistance to supply chain investigations for forced labor and its control of information, does the task force have sufficient capabilities to monitor and analyze the use of forced labor within China? These are the questions we hope our witnesses today can help us answer. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine current efforts to enforce the UFLPA, as well as the challenges encountered since the law went into effect a year and a half ago, and ultimately to identify ways that enforcement can be improved and made more effective. These are all serious matters to consider as this committee carries out its oversight responsibilities to ensure effective enforcement of the UFLPA. I want to thank our witnesses from the Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Patrol, and the Department of Labor for joining us today. I look forward to hearing their testimony. And if I can get it out of my throat there, I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Ivey, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll pass the water down to you. But I did want to say to the chairman, again, this is our second hearing. We had one before. I want to repeat, though, my deep appreciation for the fact that we're having bipartisan hearings, that, I'm looking at the witnesses. They're not Republican or Democratic witnesses on there per se. I think it's a fair opportunity to get actual information in a nonpartisan way so we can do the things that we need to do to address whatever issues there may be or provide whatever additional resources there are. And in fact, the opening statement he gave sounds a lot like what I had planned on raising as well. So I do want to thank all of you all for coming today. My throat's getting bad too now, so maybe it's that time of year. But in the first hearing, we went through a different panel. We had people come in and they talked about some of the issues they had from an industry perspective in part, with respect to the textile industry in particular. I did want to expand that out as I did in the first hearing and look at issues beyond the Uyghurs and textiles. African minerals, for example, is one that I have particular interest in, and to the extent forced labor is involved there. I've come across articles and other types of reporting that discuss the extensive issue that's there and the great problem that it's generated there. I know there's issues with respect to the supply chain and how the United States and some of the companies benefit potentially from that kind of forced labor. And I think we need to take a look at that as well. So to the extent we can discuss that today, and hopefully I'm not blindsiding you because I don't know that was the initial request on what to cover today, but that's certainly an interest of mine. And then another twist, I guess, too. I know we talked a lot about the government's role as a regulator, as an enforcer, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I also want to talk today a little bit about, or hear from you a little bit about the government as a consumer. To the extent we're talking about textiles, God only knows what the Department of Defense spends on uniforms and clothing and materials. Are there additional steps that we could take with respect to that angle, government as customer, that could provide extra leverage that we're not taking advantage of? Same with other issues like the minerals. I know that a lot of those are used in high-tech devices and hardware. Are there additional things that the federal government can do? I want to make sure that we're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk as well on our part. So to the extent there's guidance that you can give us or additional things that the government could do, probably without legislation, but if that's needed, that's fine. But just from a procurement standpoint, are there additional things that we can do to help put extra leverage on this issue? Expanding the entity list, I know that the chairman touched on that a moment ago, and I remember from some of the research I've done and some of the testimony at the first hearing that it's a lot smaller than I had expected when I started doing the research on this. And the question is, why is that? The feedback we got was there's potentially risk of going too fast and getting the government in trouble from a due process standpoint. In other words, putting businesses on the list that we couldn't prove belong there, even with the rebuttable presumption in place. But even given that, my thought, and I think the chairman just suggested this as well, seems to me that there should be more of these on the list, more businesses on the list. And I don't know, you'll have to help me out as well, too, from a jurisdictional standpoint, because I know there's a statute that governs the Uyghurs issue that doesn't necessarily cover all of the minerals or other types of forced labor. And I guess fishing is another one of those, too. So there may be a separate statute that deals with that. Help walk us through which ones cover which, and if there are different types of resources or legislative fixes or regulatory fixes that we might need to take to address each. But the entity list is a big deal for me. The task force was another one. When I took a look at the statute and I saw I think it's like 7 federal agencies, and that struck me as maybe too many cooks in the kitchen. I've been in and out of government for a long time, and I know sometimes we can get a little more bureaucratic than we need to, and especially when you have multiple departments that are involved. And I wasn't able to see if there's somebody who gets to make the final call and pull of the trigger there, because that might be one of the types of things that we need to revise. And I think the task force may be a statutory arrangement. So if that's on us, let us know, and we'll try and figure out a way to fix that. De minimis, the chair discussed that already. Another thing that I remember from the first hearing that I found disturbing was the release order issue. And my recollection of that, and you might have to set me straight on it, but sometimes the government would seize materials that we had determined had been generated or had been connected or tainted by forced labor. But it sounded like instead of us, retaining it or selling it or something like that, that we released it again. And the concern I had about that was, how does that actually punish the entity that was involved in this supply chain? I'll call it a snafu, just to not be judgmental about it. But we don't want to do something that allows them to continue to profit from whatever that material was. So if I'm mistaken on that, please let me know. But if we are releasing these materials back to the entities, and they're still benefiting and profiting from the materials that the government has now identified was somehow, there was value added based on forced labor, I don't think that's the right way to go. So, and I'm hoping we can figure out a way to address that. So I look forward to your testimony. This is not an area that is my strong suit, so I'm here to really listen and learn from what you're saying. I want to be an active and engaged partner in making sure that whatever it is that you all need, additional resources or statutory language or regulatory assistance or support, we want to make sure we get that to you, because this is a critical issue. Forced labor is a huge problem, obviously, for the people who are forced to do the labor. I think it's also a big problem for the United States and our labor community, because it really puts businesses in the United States at a very unfair disadvantage. And we want to make sure that we have a level playing field on that front. So with that, I yield back to the chair, and thank you again for this hearing.
As customary, Ranking Member Ivey opens with a very thoughtful and incisive opening statement. And so I want to remind other members of the committee that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And with our thanks to all of the witnesses for being here today, I ask that you please rise and raise your right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please be seated. And let me now formally introduce our witnesses. Ms. Krista Brzezowski is the Acting Assistant Secretary for Trade and Economic Security Policy in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Plans of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Eric Choi is the Executive Director of the Trade Remedy Law Enforcement Directorate at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Office of Trade. Ms. Thea Lee is the Deputy Undersecretary for International Affairs in the Bureau of International Labor Affairs of the U.S. Department of Labor. I thank all of the witnesses for being here, and I now recognize Ms. Krista Brzezowski for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you so much. Good morning, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you again for the opportunity today to discuss the work of the Department of Homeland Security and the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force to combat forced labor in global supply chains, including from the People's Republic of China, or the PRC. U.S. laws that prohibit importation of goods made with forced labor were established almost 100 years ago in the Tariff Act of 1930. The laws reflect our values to honor freedom and to protect human rights. They also serve to protect American workers and legitimate businesses from those who exploit the vulnerable for their own financial gain. Congress established the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, or FLETF, in 2020 to facilitate a holistic approach to combating the scourge of forced labor by leveraging the authorities of the member agencies to ensure the U.S. government is doing everything in its power to eradicate forced labor from supply chains. Then in 2021, Congress passed and the President signed into law the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA. This is the strongest tool the United States or any other country has forged in the fight against the atrocities of forced labor. The bipartisan passage of the law was a strong signal to malign actors that we would hold them accountable and that the United States will not be complicit in the exploitation of the oppressed. At DHS, we're very proud to enforce our nation's forced labor laws. The department utilizes resources and authorities across multiple operational components, including Customs and Border Protection, Homeland Security investigations, and a center that we have that is focused exclusively on countering human trafficking to advance these goals. As the chair of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, DHS, with the support and the leadership of the other agencies, is working hard to facilitate the flow of legitimate trade while collaborating with a wide range of stakeholders from across industry, civil society, and others to keep goods made with forced labor out of U.S. commerce. The efforts of DHS and the task force also complement the goals and objectives of a new center set up under DHS, the Supply Chain Resilience Center, which seeks to minimize disruptions from all hazards that threaten the supply of key goods and services, including the risks of unsustainable supply chains that involve the use of forced labor. Congress incorporated several key components of the law that make it uniquely powerful in addressing the PRC's state-sponsored, cruel, and inhumane forced labor regime, including the entities list and a rebuttable presumption enforcement mechanism, and we appreciate those strong tools. The task force identified 20 equities for the inaugural entity list and developed the practices and procedures since then for additions to the list as warranted by the facts in the law. As a result of those legal guidelines, the task force has expanded the entities list by 50%, adding 2 new entities since June 2022. And there is an active pipeline of recommendations being developed now by the task force. DHS is conducting a strategic review of every aspect of this process. We're working closely with our colleagues across the members of the task force, and our goal is to identify process improvements that can result in a transparent, consistent, and importantly, a scalable process that will allow us to significantly increase the numbers of entities included on the entity list. We have established a team, DHS has established a team within my office that is solely devoted to the development and the administration of the entity list. And we have sought out subject matter experts who are critical to our understanding of the ever-changing Chinese corporate landscape. While we have shifted considerable resources towards this very important mission, we look forward to working with Congress to sustain efforts to fulfill even further this law's mandate. Since the implementation of the law, DHS has seen significant evidence that industry is taking responsibility of understanding their supply chains seriously, including by shifting and diversifying the supply chains, and we think this is a positive development. I thank the subcommittee for your support in the fight against forced labor and for the opportunity to appear here today, and I look forward to the discussion and to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brzezowski, and I now recognize Mr. Choi for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. It's an honor to testify today on U.S. Customs and Border Protection's role in enforcing the forced labor laws and regulations of the United States, including the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA. Forced labor is an abhorrent issue, abuse of human rights. It not only affects the living and working conditions of millions of workers around the world, but it also creates unfair competition for U.S. business. As part of our critical mission to uphold our nation's laws and facilitate legitimate trade, CBP is committed to preventing goods produced or manufactured with forced labor from entering U.S. commerce and promoting accountability for the ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity afflicting Uyghurs and other religious and ethnic minority groups in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, or the XUAR, of the People's Republic of China. Since the law took effect in June 2022, CBP has stopped more than 6,000 shipments of goods valued at more than $2 billion for UFLPA-related enforcement actions. Using resources provided by Congress, CBP is strengthening our forced labor enforcement efforts by investing in personnel, training, outreach, technology, and laboratory science capabilities. The agency is using technology to map supply chains and research high-risk commodities to ensure supply chains are free of forced labor inputs. CBP is also increasing its analytical and threat detection capabilities. Through our advanced trade analytic platform, CBP developed and operationalized analytic models that identify entities operating in the XUAR, their affiliates, and entities with whom they share traits or characteristics, and indicators of evasion to further our analysis and enforcement efforts related to the UFLPA. Due to the success of utilizing these tools for UFLPA enforcement, CBP also adopted similar methodologies to identify routes by which fentanyl and pill presses enter the United States. To support compliance efforts, in March 2023, CBP held a forced labor technical expo to provide private industry the opportunity to highlight tools and technologies that promote due diligence. We issued guidance, resources for importers, and developed an interactive dashboard with statistics on UFLPA enforcement that provides insights on stopped entries by industry sector and country of export. Enforcement alone is not sufficient. CBP continues to engage with industry and importers to remind them to exercise reasonable care to ensure goods entering the United States comply with all laws and regulations. Companies have the most extensive insights into their supply chains and the responsibility to monitor their supply chains. CBP encourages companies to conduct audits, risk assessments, and other acts of due diligence. And in fiscal year 2023, CBP conducted more than 500 such engagements, resulting in improved trade facilitation for compliant importers. Additionally, through CBP's 21st Century Customs Framework strategic initiative, we engage with our stakeholders on ways to refine CBP's regulatory and statutory framework to enhance and streamline forced labor enforcement efforts. We welcome the opportunity to work with Congress to address these challenges and advance these initiatives together. CBP's forced labor enforcement efforts are robust and effective, but we do face challenges. The record level volume of de minimis or low-value shipments contain less detailed data available for CBP review. De minimis status does not exempt shipments from CBP review for violations of law, and there is no exception for de minimis shipments under UFLPA. CBP is firmly committed to meeting challenges in the de minimis context, including undertaking initiatives to increase information availability and assess risk. The agency is working closely with DHS to develop strategies to address these challenges that include regulatory changes to increase data collection and technology enhancements to improve risk management and targeting. We also look forward to working with Congress on these initiatives. CBP's enforcement efforts safeguard all industries from unfair trade practices. However, some industries, such as textiles, were highlighted in the UFLPA and have seen increased scrutiny due to the open source reporting on the use of forced labor in the production of raw materials used in their supply chains. Nearly 17% of all shipments stopped by CBP for UFLPA reviews are textiles, including apparel and footwear, and approximately 63% of these shipments were denied for noncompliance. In addition to UFLPA enforcement actions in FY 2023, CBP seized more than 5,000 textile shipments, issued approximately $19 million in commercial fraud penalties, and conducted audits, laboratory analysis, and factory verification visits that identified more than $2 million in additional duties owed to the government. CBP continues to strengthen targeting enforcement activities across all industries to prevent and penalize those who violate and circumvent tariffs and trade laws, including forced labor. CBP's forced labor enforcement efforts not only ensure fair competition and economic security for U.S. domestic industry, but they also have a direct effect on the improvement of living and working conditions for workers across the world, including the repayment of millions of withheld wages and recruitment fees that trap workers in debt bondage. We appreciate this subcommittee's continued support, and we are grateful that Congress has entrusted us with this important mission, and I'm proud of the incredibly hard work that my colleagues at CBP have undertaken in response. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. And I now recognize Ms. Thea Lee for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivey, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Forced labor is all around us. It is an invisible thread in the fabric of global commerce, woven through the global supply chains of too many products and industries. Unraveling this thread requires a multi-pronged approach involving governments, business, unions, consumers, journalists, academics, and civil society. With over 75 years of experience working at the intersection of labor rights, human rights, and the global economy, the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs, or ILAB, is uniquely positioned to guide the U.S. government's efforts to address forced labor throughout global supply chains. I would like to focus this morning on two areas of our work. First, ILAB's reporting and deep expertise bring attention to global labor abuses and provide a foundational knowledge that is used by our counterparts throughout the U.S. government. Second, ILAB's holistic approach allows us to address forced labor from multiple perspectives, including in our role on the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force and the implementation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. ILAB is the leading provider of in-depth research on global labor abuses. Our 3 flagship reports serve as valuable resources for research, advocacy, government action, and corporate responsibility. First, our annual findings on the worst forms of child labor assesses the efforts of U.S. trade beneficiary countries and territories to eliminate child labor through legislation, enforcement, policy, and social programs. Second, our list of products produced by forced or indentured child labor is intended to ensure that U.S. federal agencies do not procure goods made by forced or indentured child labor, as required by Executive Order 13126. And third, our biennial list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor, also called the TVPRA Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act list, serves as a sobering reminder of how labor exploitation infiltrates our daily lives through the coffee we drink, the produce we eat, and the garments we wear. The current TVPRA list includes 159 goods from 78 countries and areas. Of those goods, 18 are produced by forced labor in China, including several, like polysilicon, which is a key element in the production of solar panels, that involve the use of forced labor from the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Xinjiang is China's far western region, of course, where hundreds of thousands of Uyghurs, ethnic Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, and members of other persecuted groups are being arbitrarily detained and subjected to forced labor, producing goods that too often enter the U.S. domestic and global supply chains. The TVPRA list also includes lithium-ion batteries from China, made with cobalt, that was found to be mined with child labor from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These batteries are found in dozens of downstream products that we use in our daily lives, including computers, cell phones, vacuum cleaners, electric vehicles, and hearing aids. ILAB's supply chain research underlying the TVPRA list represents one of the most comprehensive efforts worldwide to identify labor risks in global supply chains. It supports our work to enforce U.S. trade laws, enabling ILAB to work with our partners across the administration and globally to combat forced labor and child labor in China, the DRC, and around the world. As an active and critical member of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, ILAB is committed to contributing and leveraging our expertise to support our partner U.S. government agencies to take enforcement actions to address labor rights abuses in global supply chains. ILAB has prioritized work on the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is an essential element in the Biden-Harris administration's efforts to eradicate forced labor from U.S. supply chains. Along with DHS, ILAB serves as co-chair of the task force's UFLPA Entity List Subcommittee. My team worked closely with the other task force agencies, developing a methodology and process to consider in reviewing additions to the entity list. ILAB is committed to moving with speed and integrity to expand the list, ensuring that the process is both robust and legally sound. The UFLPA is a powerful new tool in the fight against forced labor and human rights abuses. While it presents significant challenges for businesses entangled in complex global supply chains, it is clearly having a profound impact on promoting human rights and ethical business practices, even in its early stage. As interest in global supply chains continues to grow, ILAB is in a unique position within the U.S. government to improve working conditions and end forced labor. We will use all available trade enforcement tools, as well as labor diplomacy, multilateral engagement, and technical assistance to identify and raise awareness of the risks of labor exploitation worldwide, and to incentivize meaningful actions by both governments and private companies to prevent egregious violations of labor and human rights. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And I'll say at the inception, I think as I've learned more about this issue, and I listened actually to Ranking Member Ivey's comments last hearing and his opening statement today, what seems to elude me is, you know, you got the Uyghur Forced Labor Protection Act, which is new. You all have made the point very well that we've got almost 100 years of experience attempting to control products from forced labor entering the United States. I don't really discern that much really in your statement so far or in the report that I read on UFLPA in particular, how big the problem is, any kind of metric to indicate what the size of the problem we confront and how effective we are interdicting the problem. There are some indications, like I've heard from textile industry questions about how broadly and actively we're applying isotopic testing to indicate maybe we're not doing enough. The number of entities on the list seems awfully small. That's what I think Mr. Ivey was saying. So let me begin with Ms. Brzezowski and say, how does DHS assess the effectiveness of the efforts in slowing down the flow of goods made with forced labor in China entering the United States and more broadly?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and you're right out of the gate with a very good one. This is something that, as I came on board recently and took over the position I'm now in, I asked my team, how are we measuring, how are we inspecting our progress? How do we know that we're doing all that we can do? We say that we're committed and we want to be making a dent in this. I'll have to say that the size and extent of the challenge, I think, has been well documented. We know what we're up against. Our ability to add entities to the list, I think we are absolutely committed. I agree 100% that we need to scale that. Enactment work since enactment has really been focused on setting up a robust and methodologically sound process, but I am confident that we're now at the point where we can really start to grind those wheels and move forward much quicker. As to how we are actually, what metrics we're using and how we're measuring success, right now it is a bit anecdotally. What we're hearing from companies, the types of seizures we're seeing, we do have confidence that industry is hearing, getting the message, shifting supply chains, looking at their sources of where they're getting products. We also have money that was allocated by Congress to our Science and Technology Division to do some of that assessment. We're appreciative of those funds to be able to give us some of those metrics going forward.
Thank you, ma'am. And same sort of question to you, Mr. Choi at CBP. Speak, if you can, to how rapidly you're implementing isotopic testing, just because I've heard of that a good bit. And also, how do you measure success in enforcement? And does this amount to sort of a posturing of the United States government that's not really getting the job, that sort of shows our values, or are we actually making a tremendous dent and clamping down on this in a way that is notable within the supply chain?
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, for that question. I'll start off with addressing kind of the authorities with regards to the agencies and our nation's forced labor enforcement laws. And this goes back to, as mentioned earlier, to the Tariff Act in 1930, which did create the prohibition of goods produced with forced labor, prison labor, or the worst forms of child labor. But however, there was a consumptive demand clause within the Tariff Act that said that if the country didn't produce goods in enough quantity that satiated the domestic demand, then it was still okay. Right, so it wasn't until 2016 through the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act that repealed the consumptive demand clause out of the Tariff Act. And so we've really been kind of gone full bore since 2016 to ramp up the agency's program, but also to supplement a lot of the efforts that were already ongoing within the U.S. government, like the Department of Labor's effort as well as Department.
That's helpful. So address specifically, if you will, isotopic testing and the degree to which it's been implemented. Yes, sir.
So we have definitely been going out in the sense that we have tested the technology and in fact, using the resources that Congress did provide for us, we did acquire this past year capabilities in isotopic testing. So we have our first lab just stood up in Savannah, Georgia.
Good to know.
Just this past quarter. And we expect the other two labs in New York City and LA to also stand up here within the next 6 to 8 months as well. The equipment was acquired back in FY22 and is now getting delivered and installed, and we've got staff and scientists that we brought on board as well to do that. And so that'll increase our capacity, and we anticipate we'll be doing more isotopic testing, and we leverage that isotopic testing to investigate where we see allegations of risk or use of forced labor, or in this case, say, with the XUAR and cotton, where the cotton may be used in the supply chain.
That's encouraging to hear. I've got a lot of other great questions, but unfortunately, my time has expired, so I'll recognize Ranking Member Ivy for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. And just sort of along the lines on the isotopic testing, since we're on that. So my understanding is that that's primarily for textiles.
Yes, Ranking Member, I appreciate that question. Yes, right now that is currently capability that is principally used and proven for textiles. I know that industry is exploring that. I think there's also national labs that are looking at that capability to expand potentially to see where it could also be leveraged in other types of commodities, but right now it's principally in textiles.
Okay. By the way, the textiles industry was here and was very eager to get an expansion of the isotopic testing and said that they would be happy to lobby on your behalf for additional resources to expand that out. And I'm certainly open to that as well. But I did have this question. So with respect to, back to the African minerals issue, and my understanding is that a lot of the minerals are mined in Africa, but maybe not solely, using forced labor and child labor, that they're then sent, in many instances, to China, and then whatever steps are taken there to integrate those materials into the final product, and then they get shipped either directly or through other countries to the United States. How are we able, is there an equivalent to isotopic testing for minerals? Or, I mean, and if not, how are you able to figure out, how are we as a nation able to figure out that these materials are coming to us via forced labor or child labor?
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivy, for that question. Certainly, currently to my understanding, and I can certainly take it back as well, is that for extractives, there isn't really a scientific capability which includes the minerals and things like gold and whatnot, to be able to leverage scientific testing to determine the origin. So basically what we use and rely upon is in our surveillance and our analysis of supply chains, as well as doing deep, in-depth supply chain reviews with importations we suspect that leverage sources of forced labor.
Yeah, Ms. Lee, yes.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivy. I wanted to weigh in on this question because this is something that the Department of Labor iLab has also focused our technical assistance resources on. We have funded a technical assistance project in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that can begin to trace the cobalt from its origin in the artisanal and small mines all the way through to its end use. Much of it ends up in lithium-ion batteries, which are, in fact, manufactured in China. And as we know, China owns maybe 70% of the cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then does process most of that cobalt into lithium-ion batteries that end up in our supply chain. But so we have a new project that is starting with the artisanal mines and that is going to follow the cobalt to every stage of its subsequent production.
I might, since we're just time constrained, you might have to, if you could, send me some sort of written explanation about the details on that, and if you need additional resources to build that out, that would be good to know. But back to you, Secretary Choi. I mean, I think you mentioned something about the mineral detection. I think you said gold. Now, is that, I think from Ms. Lee's perspective, if she's talking about just tracing it from through the supply chain, if I'm hearing you correctly, is there a scientific test for the actual minerals themselves, Mr. Choi, that you were referencing, or is that something different? And if that's the case, does that mean you have to dismantle whatever the product is to get the material to test?
Ranking Member Ivy, so there is not a scientific capability to test the origin. What I was referring to was similar to what Deputy Undersecretary Lee was saying, was that we rely upon that supply chain tracing, understand who the entities are at risk, and then following it through the entire supply chain to the actual U.S. importation.
Okay. And then, boy, time runs short, doesn't it? I did have the question about the addition of entities to the list. And you said something, I guess the list was established in June. 2016, I think. Well, I think I heard from Ms. Berzakowski, was that June 2022? that you mentioned, that 2 have been added since then?
Sorry, the initial inaugural list included 20 entities, and since then, so since 2022, we've added an additional 10.
10, okay. All right, and then you mentioned that there have been more resources. I'm running over. Well, I'll yield back, but perhaps we could have a next round, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Ezell for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Ivey, if I don't use my time, you're welcome to take some of my time. This is so important. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you know, as we uncovered in our previous hearing, the Chinese Communist Party is using the Uyghur slave market to process seafood caught around the world. And this product, of course, is making it to the American markets. Using slave labor, the CCP, who do not care about people, let's just make that, we know that. They're using their product to sell at artificially low prices. This creates a clear disadvantage for shrimpers and fishermen along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, which is my district. And it's very concerning, as the fishermen and shrimpers have contacted me numerous times about this. Ms. Lee, as a member of the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force, we know that seafood that is produced by slave labor is still reaching the American market. Doesn't this suggest the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is not being enforced properly?
Thank you so much, Congressman, for that question. The allegations of forced labor use in the processing and also on the fishing of seafood are very, very serious, and we take them very seriously. I think the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is looking into whether we should be adding seafood as one of the priority sectors when we update the enforcement strategy. I have the privilege of sitting on the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and we heard some very alarming testimony from Mr. Ian Urbina, Professor Robert Stumberg from Georgetown University with respect to this. We are looking into all of the allegations. We are also looking into what tools we have at our disposal to address the allegations of forced labor and the allegations that Uyghur workers are being used to process some of the seafood that ends up back in the United States.
Thank you very much. And you know, I strongly believe that the seafood should be identified, you know, as a high priority here under the UFLPA. You agree with that? And if approved, you know, how quickly could we identify it, and so this could be, you know, officially recognized?
The Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force is looking into that right now, but even before we formally identify seafood as a priority area, there is nothing that stops our colleagues in CBP and DHS from looking into shipments or companies that might be suspicious, and I think that is something that we see as a very high priority indeed, so I share your sense of urgency, sir.
Thank you. What are some of the factors that you would consider before adding a new entity to the list? Mr. Choi? Anybody?
Yes, actually, I probably am better able to take that. We don't get into this, share some of the specific criteria, but what we are going to look at in general are the allegations that or recommendations that we're receiving from member agencies, importantly from the non-governmental organizations that are really closest to the ground and monitoring and doing research on these entities. They provide some vital inputs. We're looking at, of course, the supply chain mapping and other types of research that could give us an indication of the provenance of either the good or the corporate structure of the entities involved.
Thank you. Mr. Choi, the Gulf Coast Shrimpers advocated for the elimination of the consumptive demand loophole in Section 307. Since this loophole was repealed, I would expect robust enforcement of the prohibition of imports of goods produced by forced labor. However, CBP did not issue any withhold release orders in 2023, and CBP has not taken any additional action regarding seafood since January of 2022. Can you talk to me about this, please?
Thank you, Congressman Ezell, for that question. CBP does take the allegations in the seafood and seafood industry very seriously. We have enforced robustly by issuing withhold release orders against fishing vessels and also a fleet of Chinese vessels as well. Certainly, I think with the implementation of the UFLPA has had an impact with regards to our ability to continue or push more rapidly investigations of the allegations that we have received. But we are right now working robustly where we've increased staffing to look at the allegations that have come in, and we are looking at the allegations received in the seafood industry. We have been in close contact with Ian Arenas from the Outlaw Ocean Project, as well as other stakeholders that were involved in that. We have the information that they have, and we're looking into those allegations where we find kind of the violations of the law and violations under 307 that we will, you have a commitment, we will enforce.
You will do that?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I get, growing up there on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, just about every Saturday during shrimp season, you can go down on the docks and get fresh shrimp. But our shrimpers are just being put out of business. And for generations, they've been doing this stuff. And, we need to stop that. These people are hardworking, have done this their whole lives, and I need your help. And so I want your commitment from all of you that you will do everything you can within your power to help us get this back on track. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the subcommittee has its own expert on isotopic testing, and he's sitting to my left. That's Mr. Tanadar, and I recognize him for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop. Thank you for holding this hearing, and certainly welcome the expertise of our witnesses. Mr. Choi, we have spoken a lot today about what the government can be doing to stop forced labor goods from entering the country. However, at the end of the day, private companies, including importers and retailers, are the ones responsible for following the U.S. laws. A few questions. How can companies help ensure that their supply chain are free of forced labor? And how has CBP engaged with private sector to educate them on their responsibilities?
Congressman Tanidar, thank you for that question. The CB has engaged very robustly with industry. Together with the department, we have well over 500 engagements with industry, with stakeholders, international stakeholders, with civil society, and with our partners across the government. Principally to highlight, especially when we engage with industry, the responsibility that you mentioned that industry has to maintain good due diligence within their supply chains. With regards to the effects that Assistant Secretary Brzezowski had mentioned, is that we have seen effects where industry has been leveraging the tools and technologies that we brought folks in last March to during our Tech Expo to introduce some of the tools and technologies and solutions that private industry has been creating to help industry do due diligence in this space. And we've seen that industry has taken a very proactive stance in bringing on these capabilities to help them get better visibility into supply chains beyond Tier 2, to also leverage isotopic testing at certain points within the supply chain. If we look at textiles, we've seen industry leverage testing capabilities, whether it's at the spinning where the raw materials come in, or at certain parts where where the textiles themselves are made, or further where the garments are made. And so at certain checkpoints, the isotopic testing or scientific testing capabilities are a tool in the kit bag that industry can use to help them exercise due diligence in their supply chains.
What can we in Congress do? How can we support CBP in this investment?
Well, certainly we're very appreciative of the investment that Congress has already made with the agency. What we're looking for as far as prioritizing our resources from now and forward is being able to use those resources smartly, right? And take those resources and make our workforce more efficient. We appreciate the continued support from Congress. We'll, in the sense that we will integrate the capabilities that we brought on board to integrate into our more broad kind of enforcement platforms like our advanced trade analytic platform, which which brings in a significant amount of data, government data, public and open source data, to help us identify risk within the supply chain. We're also looking at opportunities to enhance our automated commercial environment, which all trade transactions occur, which needs to be modernized, and we have efforts underway to modernize that to keep pace with the advancements that industry has made and in global trade overall, and to help us to continue to force. Just lastly, I just want to highlight that with the investments, I mean, we did invest significantly in additional staffing, both officers and non-uniform staff within CBP. Certainly, we continue to focus on that professional development for our non-uniform staff, especially for basic entry and advanced training for them, focusing in on things like learning supply chain, doing supply chain reviews, gathering intelligence, those types of capabilities that we really need to cultivate within our non-uniform capability within the agency.
Well, I certainly thank the hardworking women and men of the CBP, and thank you for your testimony today. Mr. Chair, I'm out of time.
The gentleman yields back, and I now recognize Mr. Strong for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Chairman Bishop, Ranking Member Ivy. It's a lot more pleasant in this committee hearing than it was yesterday, but I can promise you we've got a commonality here that both sides of the aisle understands what's at risk. Ms. Brzezinski and Mr. Choi, at our previous hearing, our witnesses discussed the impact of de minimis shipments of Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act enforcement. According to these witnesses, the rapid increase in de minimis packages, particularly from China, undermines the ability of CBP to detect forced labor products or contraband. How concerned are you that the Chinese companies could take advantage of de minimis to ship goods potentially made with forced labor into the United States?
Maybe I'll start briefly, but can say that I share your concern with this challenge. As my colleague from CPP had mentioned, there is a difference in data that we get for these types of shipments, and that can complicate enforcement. Also, given the volume of these shipments, it's a complex environment. What we're doing but I do want to make clear that the targeting and the laws do apply in this environment, and we do our best with the information that we do have. In the short term, we are looking to enhance that targeting to do better using software and other different technical capabilities. In the medium term, we are looking to enhance the data that we do get through regulatory action, and over the longer term, we would be open to a conversation with Congress.
Thank you. How much visibility do we have regarding the scale of potential UFLPA violations related to the de minimis shipments?
So Congressman Strong, appreciate that question, and certainly I echo Assistant Secretary Brzezowski's comments in the sense that we recognize the challenge and the issues in the de minimis environment. Certainly, when we look at the challenges within the de minimis environment, a lot of it goes back to the lack of information that we gather as compared to traditional shipments that come in through our ports of entry. So with that, I mean, we have, since 2019, initiated two programs. One is we created a new entry type, which we call the entry type 86, it was kind of a pilot program for folks to enter de minimis shipments in through a formal process. We also had a Section 321 data pilot, which we're looking into the environment to see what additional information elements that would be helpful for us to understand who are the parties within the shipment, what's inside the box, and who the customers are. And so we've come to the culmination of both of those data pilots, and that's where we're working together with the department in a regulatory effort to introduce different ways to file entries for de minimis shipments, and then also what data elements that we would require for de minimis shipments. And we feel that with that kind of expanded information and data for each of the shipments that comes in would give us greater flexibility and greater access for our targeting systems to be able to identify risk factors and be able to stop specific shipments coming in at our ports of entry.
Thank you. A significant percentage of the U.S. textiles and apparel imports come from Central and South America countries with whom we have free trade agreements. I can think back just a matter of years ago, Alabama was home to Russell Athletics, Champion Apparel, and we were known in one area of Alabama as the sock capital of the world. With that has gone away. These agreements require firms to show that the goods they are shipping to the U.S. were produced in the region to qualify for duty-free status. What actions has DHS and CBP taken to determine whether this system is being abused to allow goods made with Uyghur forced labor to enter the U.S.?
Thank you again for that question, Congressman Strong. And so we do definitely see that as a focus area for us. I mean, textiles is a priority trade initiative, which was codified in the Trade Facilitation Trade Enforcement Act, which also means that as a priority trade initiative, it also prioritizes where we focus our resources in. And so with that, we've had consistent and continued focus within the textile area. And we focus our resources, means that we identify targeting candidates, we do audits, we do foreign verification visits here. We also identify, do cargo inspections, both at entry and also at post-release, to identify where misdescriptions of the actual shipments may be.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. I'm going to try to get one more real quick here. What actions does CDP or CBP take if it detects specific products made with forced labor being diverted through third-party countries? What actions do you take?
So if there's a legal transshipment that's occurring through third countries, that is something that we would stop. So we would detain those shipments. We would issue duty requirements to make the government whole, and then we would issue, or we could potentially, if there's recidivism or it continues, repeat offenders, we would issue penalties against those.
Thank you. I thank each of you for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and the chair's discretion will proceed to a second round of questions. Let me go back to, so, Mr. Choi, some of that was very interesting, because you addressed a number of things that, the robustness of your answer was very helpful, I thought. And Ms. Brzezowski, let me go back to you, and maybe Ms. Lee also, if I can work it in, about the UFLPA entity list, or I think that's the way to refer to it. So if what I understood is about 85% of China's cotton produce or cotton products produce is sourced from Xinjiang, which is the region where the forced labor issue is most pronounced. And just thinking about the size of the Chinese economy and the amount in general knowledge or general perception about the amount of commerce in those goods to the United States, I'm always here, we don't have the expertise maybe to gauge everything that you guys are doing, but we can certainly hear when what you're saying sounds like it's really, you're getting after it. And we want to hear that, obviously. When I hear the size of the list in contrast to those facts, it just seems striking. Ms. Lee, before I ask Ms. Brzezowski, you mentioned the TVPRA list. So I guess you've got some sort of a list, sort of like, I hear about these lists of Treasury designating lists of foreign bad actors and so forth. So I understand all these things exist in law. How many entities or people on the TVPRA list? Any idea?
Sure, and there are not entities, there aren't specific companies on the TVPRA list. What we identify is a product and a country. So, for example, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's really, what our list is meant to be is sort of a starting point, and I think it is a resource that CBP and DHS would use to say, oh, there might be a problem with, for example, cobalt.
So maybe and that's helpful. My question is probably not that very apt, though, because I don't know if there's any comparison to be drawn here or anything. But Ms. Brzezowski, just back to you. And you talked about your team. You got a bunch of things in the works. And when you guys come back, maybe I won't still be here, but at the end of this year or shortly thereafter, we'll hear about a lot of additional entities added to the list. But I'd like you to speak to that a little bit more. What's flawed about my perception of what I just suggested? China is a massive economic actor, big market. 85% was a figure that I heard of their products are sourced to Xinjiang. So why so few people, even on the initial list? Why wasn't it hundreds or thousands of entities?
No, thank you for your question. And again, I find myself in the good position of being able to agree with you on the ultimate goal of wanting to get this list list up and expanded. I think that the team has done very impressive work since the relatively short time of the enactment of the law, setting up not only frameworks, but a robust methodology that is going to stand not only the test of time, but legal scrutiny. So we were pulling together from a broad array of expertise across agencies of administrative processes and managing and running and creating other types of entity lists. So that is where we were able to leverage the expertise and the resources and the know-how of the broad array of the task force members. But you're right that the numbers themselves might not reflect the totality of that work.
You talk about legally sound. Is this something that, like, companies that are listed litigate against the United States government?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Mr. Choi, Mr. Ivey made reference to this issue. What happens when CBP stops its shipment and determines it shouldn't be admitted into the U.S.? Is it released back to the shipper, or is it seized?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Bishop. So when the shipment is stopped, or when it comes in and we've identified this as potentially something that could be stopped pursuant to the UFLPA, there's two somewhat scenarios in this. And the one that where we have clear say direct shipments, say from the XUAR, where we know specifically that this shipment is attributed back to a Xinjiang manufacturer, producer, or an entity that's identified on the entity list, that those shipments are excluded, meaning that they are denied entry into the U.S. commerce. So the importer does have the ability to re-export that shipment, but then also where we have shipments where we feel that where we know that there's ties within the supply chain, not necessarily produced in the Xinjiang region of China, where it's say manufactured further downstream with inputs from the Xinjiang region of China. Those shipments are detained, and then we work together with the importer where they have the ability to submit matters on behalf of those entries to demonstrate whether the UFLPA does or doesn't apply to those specific shipments. In that case, we request a full supply chain documentation from the raw materials to all inputs to the actual importation of the goods.
My time has expired, so I yield to recognize Mr. Ivey for his 5 minutes in the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd want to follow up on that question, and actually a question earlier with respect to perishables, in that instance, seafood. But so you identify a shipment that is in violation, I guess. And by the way, the description of the process you just outlined, is that only for textiles, or would that apply for minerals or seafood as well?
That applies across the board.
All right. And then, okay, so you detain it, you mentioned. How fast is that process? Because if you got perishables, I would assume it would have to move very, very quickly for you to run your traps and make a determination about whether there's a violation there or not. How would that work?
So according to the regulations, the importer has 30 days to submit matters on behalf of the specific entry to the responding center of excellence and expertise. And so it's really up to the importer to have their documentation ready. So if they don't have that documentation ready, they can go up to 30 days. They can request an extension, but if the importer has their documentation ready, the centers have been able to clear through shipments relatively quickly within 7 to 14 days.
Okay, so how does that work for seafood? I mean, because that's a very long, especially 30 days. That's just too long. So I mean, what do you do in that instance?
Well, in that instance, I mean, it would be incumbent upon the importer to make a decision of whether they would either re-export those shipments or figure out ways to store and maintain those shipments.
And when you say re-export, you mean send it to someplace other than the United States?
That's correct, yes, sir.
All right, so then the importer, and whether it's seafood or minerals or textiles, still would have the opportunity to profit from the child labor or forced labor that we had identified?
So if the importer re-exports those goods, yes. Sure.
All right, Has Congress given you the legal authority to seize these imported materials? Not just detain, but to seize them?
So we do have the regulatory authority to seize those goods. It would depend. It would depend based upon the case and the scenario by which those entries are. But also, statutorily, there are challenges with regards to the seizure process that is lengthy, and with regards to the burden on the agency as well.
Okay, we'll set perishables to the side for the moment, just because of the time sensitivity, obviously, with those. But let's say minerals, with respect to the batteries, or with respect to textiles. How is their determination made? Because from my I'll just say this, my perspective is if we really want to put sanctions in place that punish these companies that are involved in the supply chain, that we've effectively traced back to forced labor or child labor, allowing them to just send it to Plan B and get the same amount of money doesn't seem to really get the message across in the same way. I know the United States is a gigantic market and everybody wants to continue with that, but you know, if they, and I think this is what we got from the Textiles Association testimony, if they just keep pushing the mass over and hoping that the vast majority of it will get through, but every now and then something will get caught, but it still just gets redirected, they just sell it somewhere else. It seems to me that we're not, using our tools sufficiently to send the message back. This isn't a criticism of you all. I'm just, this is a question, but this is my sense of it from what I think I'm hearing. So what's your take out to the whole panel? What's your take on that issue?
From a, maybe not from the operational perspective at the border, but I could also say that this is why it's so absolutely imperative that we have partnerships with foreign governments, so that as these, if seizures are not able to be accommodated on each and every instance, that these goods are not finding their way into other countries, and that as a collective, we're working against the reimport of these violative goods. I'll give one more note that as the task force, this is one of our primary responsibilities. So in addition to creating the entities list, one of the key responsibilities is to actually conduct that engagement, to go out to not only the private sector, companies for education, which is largely being done by...
Just to reclaim quickly, and
Yep, please.
I've expired on time to reclaim, but just to follow up, do we have the legal authority? So you're working to make sure there are other countries that aren't taking it, but apparently that means that there are other countries that do. No offense to no criticism. But do we have the legal authority? Do you have the legal authority to just say, you know what, forget all of that. This is an illegal shipment. We're using forced labor. We're going to seize it. And I don't know, the government seizes, certainly in the criminal world, seizes materials all the time and deals with it in that way. Do you have the authority to do that, or is that something that Congress would have to give you?
Thank you. The agency has the authority to seize, and so in the context of the UFLPA, where we have specific shipments, where we have the specific confidence, or the exact confidence that we know that these are prohibited goods, we do have that authority to seize. The challenge that we have is where, and those are things that as we implement things like our withhold release order, or have entities on the entity list, or we have specific shipments, and we do provide notification to the importers when shipments are entered into the system that are going to be subject to the UFLPA that come directly from the Xinjiang region. So we see a decline in those shipments, specific shipments coming into the United States. And so where the challenge being is where the inputs then are taken either through third countries, or those inputs are used in downstream manufacturing processes where, and also the importer then has the ability to demonstrate the entire supply chain. So during that time, we don't necessarily have the specific standing to seize the shipment at that point in time. And so any time during that process, the importer does have the right to be able to re-export those shipments.
Well, I thank the chair thank you for your candor with the panel, and I thank the chair for letting me run over time.
Gentleman yields back. I think it's been very helpful, and I think we'll proceed to discretionary third round for just a minute. You and I think Mr. Ezell doesn't care to ask, doesn't have more questions, so he waves. So let me just again sort of pursue the line that you were on. No, let me take a different, there are a couple thoughts conflicting in my mind. Mr. Choi, I think you said in your earlier that the de minimis exemption or exception, whatever it's called, does not apply to the UFLPA. Did I get that straight?
Chairman Bishop, the de minimis exception does apply to the, doesn't apply, meaning
Does not apply
there is
to-
no UFLPA exception in de minimis,
Okay.
for de minimis.
I'm sorry, say that part again. There's no UFLPA exception?
So there is no de minimis exception within the UFLPA. So the de minimis doesn't apply, sorry.
Take another shot and just explain to me what that means. How does that, what is the implications of that?
So meaning that in all environments where cargo or shipments or entries are filed, if something is coming through de minimis, it's still going through all our screening systems. All our
Okay.
systems.
So like if, otherwise, I mean, the basic notion of the de minimis exemption, as I understand it, is like if you're purchasing a certain amount, and I don't remember, somebody told me $800 or something like that.
$800 per day per person.
Yeah, so if somebody gets some goods from abroad, they can kind of bring them in and they're not subject to the same usual scrutiny by CBP, basically. Is that the idea?
Well, it's not subject to duties and
Okay.
taxes, right?
Okay. But there's no such de minimis exemption for anything that's covered by the UFLPA?
So, right, there isn't. So even if it comes in through de minimis, the UFLPA still applies.
Still applies.
That's right.
Got it. So as far as, well, let me ask this question, though, about the de minimis exemption. And Ms. Brzezowski, maybe I'll go to you in this part of it. You know, I sketched out in my opening statement some of the massive numbers, the massive increases in goods that come in with respect to the de minimis exemption. And I think some suspect that becomes a huge source of evasion of the interdiction of forced labor produced goods. And I know you have some background in large e-commerce platforms. To what degree, or can you comment at all on whether e-commerce platforms are a driver of that massive expansion of the exploitation of the de minimis exemption?
In my current role, what I can comment on is the challenge that this environment presents for our folks at the border for targeting, and that we have seen an exponential rise over the last number of years. I think there's any number of factors that go into this. Key points being we are working hard in a very, very challenging environment. These requirements, as maybe to put it in another way, we are enforcing on forced labor laws in this particular channel, but it's more challenging because of the limited amount of data that we get, which of course drives our targeting capabilities and our decision making.
All right, and Mr. Choi, thank you very much for trying to persist through my torturous series of questions about the de minimis exemption. I'm not sure I understand it fully, but I kind of get the gist. Let me ask about this. You talked about 3 isotopic testing labs or testing labs being stood up. 1 is already in operation. That sounds good. What kind of quantity of, can you quantify the amount of testing in some way that you anticipate those labs being able to do, the one that's been set up and the other 2 that you expect to be coming online, and the difference that it'll make?
Well, I can certainly take back the quantification. I don't have that stats in front of me currently right now. But I can just generally talk about with regards to how we leverage the isotopic testing and how we anticipate that it would be leveraged. I mean, certainly we've used isotopic testing up to this point to investigate supply chains, investigate where we have received allegations and have perceived risks of entities and entities that are involved in the use of using inputs from the Xinjiang region, and that informs our targeting. But then also, we do educate and we do inform our folks out in the field, and so that education and training also gives the ability to our officers at our port of entry and our import specialists to identify shipments, pull samples, and then send them off for testing as well.
How if at all, are the capacities of CBP to address this problem, how have they been affected or impaired by sort of conditions at the border more generally that we've heard about? A lot of, agents being moved from different regions to come to the southwestern border and so forth. Does that have any impact on this part of CBP's responsibilities?
I would just say that the agency's border security mission is foremost, and then our focus with regards to the security within the cargo environment as well is also foremost as well. We'd continue to, regardless of the conditions, continue to focus on that and maintain that as a high priority.
So I'll take that as you keep trying to do your job, but yeah, there's probably an impact, unless you're telling me something dramatically different. That's what I read and what you just shared. I yield back and recognize Mr. Ivey for his final round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on the chair's question about the testing, I was kind of curious about the logistics of that. So you've got a test facility, I think you said it's in Georgia?
Yes, sir. We have one in Savannah, Georgia that's operational currently.
Okay, so whatever you want to test gets shipped from whatever port the material is stopped at, and then you ship it to Georgia? Is that how it works?
That's correct. So there's a chain of custody that's established, and then it's shipped to the labs to test. So the samples are pulled, but for the isotopic testing, there is the highlight that it does take, those samples are pulled, but those samples then are subsequently destroyed by the testing.
Yeah. How long does it take to ship, test, and then make a decision? And while the testing is being done, I'm assuming nothing's being withheld at that or seized at that point. These tests are done independently of a seizure determination. Is that right?
It depends. So the test could be conducted when the shipment has been detained, or they could be conducted when we're conducting our risk assessments and our surveillance of specific shipment lines. And as far as the time it would take to go from the port to the lab, is just it'd be fairly quick with regards to the express carriers taking those shipments. So as far as the time it would take to actually conduct the test, I can certainly take that back.
Okay. I had a question with respect to the seize release issue that we were discussing a few minutes ago. And apparently someone decides at some point where, okay, we've identified this, it's a problem, but we're going to release it. Then there's another scenario where it gets seized. Who makes that determination? Is there a department or agency that does that, or who makes that decision?
Thank you for that question, Ranking Member Ivey. So the port director has the authorities to make those decisions. Okay.
You also mentioned $19 million in fraud and penalties, I think, at one point that had been imposed. What is that on? Is that on the textiles piece, or is that across the board? Or?
Oh, those were for textiles specifically in FY23, and so those were for a couple of various issues, whether it's from valuation, misdeclaring the items, or declaring that claiming free trade agreement status.
Have there been civil penalties imposed with respect to the minerals issue that we were discussing?
I'll have to take that back, Member Ivey, and I can certainly discuss that with your staff.
Okay. And then I think you mentioned, and I think the chair referenced this as well, border security. I think it might have been your testimony, Mr. Choi, with respect to fentanyl. And I was kind of curious about that. Using a test to inspect supply chains, threat detection, and my notes have that fentanyl was mentioned in there somewhere, but I wasn't clear on it, so I want to get a follow-up explanation.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey, for that question. Certainly, the agency's effort in fight against fentanyl has been one of the top priorities for the agency. Certainly, the efforts behind the UFLPA and the capabilities that we brought on board and the capabilities we created through our advanced trade analytical platform to provide modeling of how trade flows based upon kind of known risks and threats. That has given us the ability to look at where potential risks and where that fentanyl may be entering in through our ports of entry. And so that's where I had mentioned fentanyl within my opening statement or my opening remarks. But certainly I just want to highlight that, CBP's, of course, our combination of interdiction and intel capabilities and our border search authorities puts us in a very unique position with regards to the fight against fentanyl. And so we issued our new strategy to combat fentanyl and synthetic drugs in October of last year, which really is addressing kind of the current environment, the changing threat, and in that focus, and working together with our department colleagues, our fellow law enforcement colleagues within the department, as well as with the interagency, have really kind of focused significantly on that effort. And just kind of the stats alone, that in fiscal year 2023, CBP seized well over 27,000 pounds of fentanyl at our border.
Let me reclaim my time. I apologize. I am curious about which ports are which with respect to fentanyl, textiles, minerals. I don't know how extensive the Border Patrol. I guess you're probably at every port of entry, but hearing more about how that works and which testing's done where would be great. And then if I could get one last question in. One of the issues that I've heard the challenges for putting more entities on the list is that companies have figured this out and they're starting to take steps to cover their tracks. And I guess that goes to some extent to the supply chain mapping piece that was mentioned a moment ago. But what sorts of things can we do to the extent I don't want you giving tips to the importers about what's there and what to circumvent, but to the extent you can tell us about it, what sorts of things are you doing to defeat that effort to cover their tracks?
I'd actually maybe take a first stab at this, but maybe put it in a slightly different light with regard to the importers. I think the vast majority of importers are as repulsed by this important practice as we are and actively taking steps to eradicate it from their supply chain. So I think we've got partners in them and need to leverage not only their capabilities, but also use them to enhance ours. So a lot of these tools and a lot of these analytic tools and anecdotes that we're getting about the impact it's having are coming from importers and from the private sectors who have really extensive capabilities to be mapping their own supply chain. I think what we're trying to do is send a very strong demand signal with our enforcement, with our ramping up of the entities list, that this is serious and that we'll work with importers to make sure they have the information they need to be compliant, but that the consequences for noncompliance will be severe and that they will be held accountable. In the flip side of that, making sure that there's an appreciation of the fact that diverse and resilient supply chain not only in this case are the right thing to do to combat forced labor, but have a economic and resiliency benefit to companies as well.
I'm noting I'm running over my time, and I apologize to the chair, but if we could get comments from the last two on the panel on the same, and I apologize for cutting you off, but.
Thank you, Ranking Member Ivey. Just to add to what Assistant Secretary Brzezowski said, I think there's no question that companies and the Chinese government are taking steps to obfuscate the supply chain and so on. And so I think that just speaks to how important it is that we ramp up all the work that we've talked about today with respect to supply chain tracing, with respect to enforcement. And I think that the point that Assistant Secretary Brzezowski made also, that there is an enormous burden and an obligation on the part of the ultimate companies, the companies at the top of the supply chain, to make sure that they are aware of and taking steps to remove these entities from their supply chain. They have the power to do that, and I think that the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the rebuttable presumption, the forced labor import ban in whole or in part is a tremendously powerful tool, and that we are, I think, doing everything within our power, and I think the resources that CBP and DHS and DOL and the other forced labor enforcement task force agencies have are essential to making sure that we can do the research, and follow through to make sure that we are able to trace the complicated corporate structures and the complicated supply chains in order to be able to do our best job to enforce this law.
And let me give Mr. Choi the last word.
Well, I echo Deputy Undersecretary Lee's comments, and as well as Assistant Secretary Brzezowski's. I couldn't say it any better. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
The gentleman yields back. It's perfunctory in these hearings to thank the witnesses for appearing, and I really want to do that earnestly today. I've had occasion more than once to be critical of the either forthcomingness or the preparedness of witnesses before committees. This has been an exceptional panel of witnesses. I always have particularly high regard for Customs and Border Patrol, and certainly those of you serving in the other departments, agencies represented here. But thank you very much. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask you to respond to those in writing if they're forthcoming pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will be held open for 10 days. Without objection, subcommittee stands adjourned.